Thank you and good morning. I'm Pam Willis-Burden and I come in from far north Queensland. I live between Port Douglas and Mosman and I'm the Secretary of the Douglas Shire Historical Society. 18 months ago I published a book called Port's People. This is a show and tell, this is my PowerPoint presentation. This was based on 28 oral history interviews I conducted with the local people of Port Douglas. I'd never interviewed people before, although my background is in film and television, and for many years I've been a script supervisor on feature films. But even having been surrounded by sound gear on the set, I had no idea of the equipment I'd need to record oral histories or how to go about the project. But with the help of the Oral History Association of Queensland and their email network and the invaluable Oral History Handbook, I began. This is the Oral History Handbook, if anyone hasn't seen it. It's really terrific. As the Secretary of the Douglas Shire Historical Society, I had some credentials to approach interviewees, but basically it was learn as you go. So my paper today is how to begin your very first oral history project. Getting the idea is the first thing. My idea came from two groups of friends who were leaving Port Douglas 5 years ago, saying it had become too busy, too commercialised and wasn't like the old days. They'd both been in business there for 20 years. I felt compelled to record their memories somehow, but writing a small piece for the local paper didn't seem to be enough, so I embarked on my project of recording the tales of the growth of Port Douglas from sleepy fishing village to five-star resort. Your idea might spring from something you've heard about, like an old hotel being pulled down, which might lead to talking to the previous licensees of all the pubs in your area, or somebody told you about a lady in an old folks village who used to sing with Dame Nellie Melba, which inspired you to speak to not only her but others in the complex about memories of their old days. Or you might just want to talk to your grandpa about his memories of the family. Now, if it's not just grandpa, you need to work out how to choose your interviewees. The two main problems of working in a small community like mine are firstly the reluctance of some people to be involved, and secondly the jealousies of those who are not. So Port's People caused controversy when it was published. Who chose who was going to be in it? I was asked belligerently, and I said I did. Well, why didn't you interview me? I've been here much longer than her, she said. And I didn't like to say that her had many more interesting stories and could tell them in a much more entertaining way. Alternatively, some other people weren't so keen. Once I'd signed up with some of their friends or someone who was important, they became more confident and agreed. So sometimes you need to work on the kingpin of a group to get others to join in. I specifically chose people who told me stories about living in the town 10 or 20 or 30 years ago, or people who had a large influence on some part of village life, a developer, a long-serving doctor and a councillor. I knew all these folk personally, but as I spoke to them, some recommended that I speak to their friends because they know much more about this than me, or they've got a great story to tell too, or you can't do this project without talking to so-and-so. Ultimately, some people who should have been included weren't because of the pressure of getting the book published. After 4 tries, I was given a grant from the Gambling Community Benefit Fund, and I had to complete everything in 6 months. So that's an extremely tight schedule. So the time came to stop interviewing and start transcribing and editing and collecting photographs. I still feel I've missed some people out, but I'll go back and record their stories another time. Now, structuring your entire project, I made a list of questions which would keep the focus on recent history. And this kept the discussion of the grandson's success at soccer off the tape. In every case, I sent questions early to give the interviewee time to reflect on his answers, and I asked if he had any photographs he'd like to share. On the day of the interview, photos are a great asset, prompting memories and stories that you don't expect. I asked the same question of many of the interviewees to get a different reaction. Have you ever been through a cyclone? Can you describe the main street back then? It's important to remember not to ask questions that only need a yes or no answer. What did you do for fun? After a few interviews, I realised that every story was beginning to revolve around the pub. This was probably quite true of a little village where not many people worked and the weather was hot and thirsty, but it wasn't where I wanted the whole story to go. So I approached an artist and a musician to take part, to change the emphasis. The artist hadn't ever been into the pub, and the muso had been into every one of them, but to work, not to play. So then the project became more balanced. Now I've learned that when you make your first list of interviewees, you should choose people from various walks of life, or with differing ideas on the same subject. Researching your interviewee. It's very important to know some of his background before you begin. Discuss with him what he'd like to talk about, and ask his family and friends what his favourite stories are. I recently interviewed an old fellow whose grandmother had taken a shot at an intruding Kanaka at the turn of the last century. The Kanakas are South Sea Islander imported to work on the sugarcane. And if I hadn't known to ask him about that story, I doubt if he would have brought out the gold Albert chain with the bullet dangling from the end to show me. He said his grandfather had asked the hospital to dig the bullet out of the man, thus proving that his wife had only winged him and wasn't a murderess. And the family kept the bullet. And the fascinating story that came from that was about the lives of the Kanakas who were working the sugarcane at that time. If your project's centred on an event, say a storm, read all the newspaper reports you can about it first, so you have good background knowledge of the facts before you start asking more personal questions of the survivors. Now, equipment, everyone's been talking about equipment. I'll show you what I use, but I'm a bit old-fashioned. We had a bad experience with a mini disc recorder, so we've gone back to the old-fashioned Marantz, which is this is our PMD 222. It's a Marantz cassette recorder which used to be used by radio interviewers, and it's nice and sturdy, and it's got very big buttons, which is the main thing for us. We've got a few older people who try and do interviews, take the gear, and the mini disc recorder had a little controlling pin that was the size of a pinhead, and you couldn't operate it. So we've gone back to this, and we're very happy with it, and we can put our cassettes onto CD through the computer, so it's sort of digital. And we've also got a transcribing machine that takes cassettes as well, with a foot pedal and a headphone, so it makes it fairly easy. So I'll be talking about tapes all the way through here, but the same sort of thing applies to CDs or flashcards. Now I've also found that using these little lapel mics is much better up there, so these just clip on. And we've now got 4 of these little things. It's better than for us it's better than putting a mic stand on the table, because we've got overhead fans up there and we get a lot of interfering noise, so we find that once they're on, the participants seem to just get used to them and not worry so much about the mic. But we still have to have the little windsocks on the end of them just to keep the wind out. The State Library of Queensland here in Brisbane has a Marantz cassette recorder and a microphone available to borrow, which is a great jumping off point. And I've just learned at this conference they've also got some digital equipment, so you can borrow that. You just have to pay for the freight. And I was able to borrow it for 3 months, which gave me confidence to continue to record interviews and then to apply for the grant to buy our own equipment. So it's a great service. But whatever equipment you have, play with it and experiment on friends before you take it to your first interview. Make sure you know how to set the recording volume levels and how far away to place your mics and where to put them on people for the best possible quality. And I think Suzanne Gibson's workshop this morning will give you a much better idea too of the equipment to use, and the Oral History Handbook's got a good list. And that I've been going to a place here called Music Lab in Brisbane, and there's a good guy there called Warwick, if anyone's interested in talking to him. So, now finance is sort of tricky. Once you've decided on your equipment and the form your project will take, it's time to look for some funding, not to pay yourself, but to pay for the gear and publishing. If you're working at a university or for a council, you don't have to worry about this section, but for individuals and historical societies, it's a major problem. Our local council and library were both very helpful in telling me how to apply for a grant and which ones were available at the time. Often there's a cultural or community officer at the council, and they send information on grants from many different agencies. It's time-consuming to fill in the application forms. You have to provide letters of support from prominent people in your community and write a convincing project outline. And you have to give quotes for everything you want funded. So don't forget to include extras, like, for example, if you need to travel to do an interview, you might have to put in a bit of money to get to that interview. You need to estimate how many tapes you'll need. I used 4 60-minute cassettes for most interviews, 2 for the original and 2 for backups. I didn't want to ruin the originals by running backwards and forth over the transcriptions, but once I've completed the transcriptions, I recycle the backups for another interview. 60-minute tapes are better than 90 because they don't stretch and cause any sound distortions. Now, at this stage, you really should decide on the end use for your project. So if you're publishing a book, it will cost a lot more than just recording interviews because of printing costs. You could produce a CD of the entire interview or just excerpts from it. But do you want music or other sound effects in the background? The more elaborate it is, the more you might need a professional sound engineer, which will incur a fee. Or you can make a DVD and include some photos, or use parts of the interview as background for a museum exhibit, or make a radio program. But whatever you decide, all these extras need to be costed at the beginning because you only get one chance at total funding. Sometimes private sponsorship is possible if a company or a rich individual believes in the project and decides to back it, but you'll still have to provide a breakdown of costs. Now, getting approval from the interviewee, I take a release form which says that the participant agrees to be interviewed and that if the transcript is printed, she must be shown it before publication. This worked very well, except once. One interviewee insisted in rewriting her interview because she thought she sounded stupid in the transcript. So her entry in the book is very literary and doesn't sound like her speaking at all. And she didn't sound stupid. I contemplated leaving her out altogether, but her story was so good and no one else knew all the details that I left her in. Another interviewee told a gripping story of cattle rustlers 50 years ago, and he named them. But 2 weeks after our recording session, he rang to say he was worried about publishing their names because he might be sued by their relatives, and he wanted the whole topic erased from the transcript and the recording. I persuaded him that we'd write on his release form that their names were not to be printed until after he died. Apparently you can't sue a dead man. So we've preserved a great story without danger of legal action. I also like to give credit for any photographs that I use. So in Ports People, most of the photographs have their owner's name beside them. And even newspaper companies will usually let you use photographs if you give them a credit. And don't forget to credit any funding agencies or private sponsors who've been helpful to your project. Conducting the interview. One day I forgot to take the blank tapes, so make sure you're totally prepared. I make a list of the things to remember to take to the interview. Tapes, recorder, extra batteries, microphones, leads, a power board and extension, a clipboard with a list of questions, a release form, a pen. Make sure you've tested the equipment the night before on your husband or your flatmate, and take more tapes than you think you'll need. I also take a stopwatch, so when we're near the end of the tape, I know that with 2 minutes to go, I don't ask a question that's going to require a long answer, because the train of thought's often lost while you're turning the tape over. It's important to identify each new tape that you record on, so say the tape number and side. This is tape 1, side A of an interview with John Smith, recorded on, say the date, at their home at 27 Smith Street, Smithton, for the project Ports People. The interviewer is, say your name, and you can do the first side before you leave home, but it's important to do side B and the tape 2 while you're at the interview, and don't forget to write the details on the label of the tape as well. When you arrive for the interview, head for the dining table or the kitchen table. Then you can put your recorder on it, have your clipboard of questions handy, and be able to face your interviewee. Ask that any caged birds or barking dogs be put outside.
Or farting dogs.
Oh, farting dogs. And don't stand up next to the chiming clock. My worst interview was ruined by a ride-on mower that started up next door when we were halfway through. And you have to decide whether to stop for an hour and only talk about the weather, or ask the mower man to stop, or abandon your interview and come back another day. Everyone's concentration is ruined when you try and battle a bad exterior noise, and the results of the interview won't be good. Try not to talk about anything to do with the interview while you're setting up your gear, because when you're about to put it on tape, they often say, I told you all that before. I start each interview the same way, to perform a little sound test and to make sure all the equipment's working and the levels are right. I ask them to tell me their full name, their date of birth and where they were born. The answers are easy, they break the ice, the sound test's been done, and then we get on with the rest of the interview. It's most important that you listen to your interviewee rather than just follow your list of questions. So you can follow up on a comment or an interesting story that you might not have heard before, and make notes during their answers of anything you want to follow up on so you don't interrupt their flow right there. Ask them how to spell names you're not familiar with. And if he says it was about this high, indicating with his hands, you should say 2 metres, so he can say, yep, about that. It's really important not to try to interrupt and don't say, oh yes, while he's talking. I find smiling and nodding has the same encouraging effect without overlapping his story. Don't jump in on his pauses. Sometimes he might just be trying to think of the next thing to say or to remember something. If you don't fill the pause, often he will, and you'll get more of the story than you expect. If the phone rings, turn the recorder off. But remember the last topic, so when you start again, you can say, now Bill, you were telling me about painting the pub. I like to make a backup copy at the same time as using the Marantz, so I take my transcribing machine and just put it in the record mode. The quality's not as good, but it's fine for transcribing, and I've got a backup then. When you're interviewing older people, usually an hour and a half is enough. After that they get tired and you can always come back another day. I find mornings are better when they're fresher. When you finish, don't forget to snap the tabs out of the cassettes, original cassettes, so you don't accidentally record over your interview. I also take my digital camera with me and I ask if I can copy their photographs. So it's much safer than taking away their precious originals. And I usually take a photograph of them as well in their own environment, which can be used on the cover of a transcript or on the tape or the CD. Now, do you work as a team or individually? The more people in the room during the interview, the more problems of overlapping occur. People tend to talk over each other during normal conversation, but during a recording it can be very confusing and it can be difficult to hear one voice. The little lapel mics are good for this, but if possible, interview people individually. When interviewing people with limited English, ask your translator to wait until the interviewee is finished speaking. Unfortunately, sometimes they get into a conversation with each other in the other language and forget about translating. I had an adult daughter translate for her elderly Italian parents, and at one stage they had a full-on argument about something. Arms were waved and the voices were raised and they yelled at each other, and unfortunately I don't think the translation came out on the side of the parents. But if it's really important, it's worth giving the tape to an independent translator. In our small country area, I sometimes work with another historical society member who was born there. She gives the confidence to the local interviewees who regard me as a trespassing stranger who's only been there for 15 years. So she usually arranges the interview, and we both compile a list of questions, and we both go to the recording, but only one asks the questions. Transcriptions. I know this is a controversial subject. At the beginning, I didn't know whether to transcribe the whole interview or just the parts that were relevant to the project. I tried the quick way, but I realised that firstly, I might be missing out on something I wanted to go back to later. And secondly, I might never revisit that interview, and so I should transcribe the whole thing then and there. It's extremely time-consuming, but worthwhile. I do an index as I go, so I list the main topics and where they are on the tape, so that way you can search quickly for something. But transcribing a 1-hour interview can take 4 or 5 hours, depending on how quickly you can type. I found it essential in preparing the book for editing. I had arguments with myself about changing the grammar. I didn't want to make people appear foolish when they said we was going, but I wanted to retain the flavour of their language. So I compromised and I changed some things and not others. And readers comment that it sounds just the way Alan speaks, so that was the ultimate aim. The other temptation is to write it down as it sounds phonetically. An example of this is a place near Port Douglas, which is spelled Killaloe, like this, K-I-L-L-A-L-O-E, and the newer locals call it Killaloe, but the older residents call it Killaloe because that's the way it was pronounced in Ireland where the name came from. So this time I transcribed it the way it sounded with the L-O-O on the end. You can employ someone to do the transcribing, but it's expensive and they don't make decisions about grammar and about these place names, and they often don't recognise local names. That's also a concern with digital voice recognition software. If you're going into print, editing is also difficult. What to leave out? I condensed an hour of interview into about 1,000 words of text. I had to make sure I kept to the topic, and I was also constrained by the number of pages in the book, so I had to be ruthless, but it's a racy read. Storage. Once you finish the interview, it's important to store the tapes in a safe and cool place. It's the same with your flashcards and your CDs. And in Far North Queensland, this usually means under the stairs in a plastic box with a tight lid. I offered my collection to the John Oxley Library, Oral History Collections Department here in Brisbane, and I was lucky enough to have it accepted. Or the local library might be equally keen to have it. I provided full transcripts of each interview in Word format on a CD, so it's easy to search for a name or a topic, and I gave them a copy of Quartz People, the book too. So in conclusion, when all the work's done, we had a book launch and we invited all the participants, and I should have taken the record to that because some of them hadn't seen each other for years and they had all these great stories to swap. You never seem to have enough time to get all the stories. I've been back to a couple of people and recorded another 2 hours and it's still not enough. But I've found that the more interviews I do, the more confident I've become. So it is true that practice makes perfect. I'd like to thank the Douglas Shire Council, which will be no more after the March local council amalgamations, but that's another story. But they provided me with a RADF grant, Regional Arts Development Fund grant, to attend this conference. Thank you very much.
Have you thought of interviewing the exiting Shire Council staff and councillors?
Yes, that's a must. We've got to do that because it's one of the most dysfunctional councils we've had. So getting their stories, I think once they've actually gone out of office, we've got to do that.
Sometimes what we all forget is the living history of what's happening right now, get it now.
Yes.
Before they all get off overseas.